Well, thanks so much for being here today. Yeah, okay, we're mic'd up. When Dean introduced us here this morning, introduced us to GamesBeat this year, one of the things he said is that one of the things he prides himself on in his coverage of the industry is how he can get really granular and dive deep and also take a big step back and ask big picture questions, and that mix of coverage is part of what makes GamesBeat GamesBeat. And so what I'd like to do here today with John is take a really big step back, because as a science fiction writer, part of my job is to take a step so far back that whatever I end up writing about feels really weird to everyone reading it. And I think that that's where we can really dig deep today, because I think that that's where some of the most interesting questions today lie. And so I'd just like to start with something simple, which is...
Could I say something, Eliot?
Oh, please.
So I just want to say, whenever Dean invited me here to talk about science fiction with Eliot, I was like, wow, I cannot work for a day and talk about sci-fi at a gaming conference. But for me, sci-fi has been a great source of work inspiration, of ideas and just motivation. So yeah, I'm eager to talk about it and maybe learn something from you in terms of what you're thinking about and writing about. And hopefully we'll talk a little bit about your new book.
Yeah, I'd love to. Yeah, let's make it a conversation, not an interview. But why don't we start there? So, famously, cell phones were in part inspired by Star Trek, right? The Amazon Kindle was actually pulled directly from a Neil Stephenson novel called The Diamond Age. We actually, there were all these nice photos here up on the screen, with Ready Player One on it. And science fiction has been a source of inspiration for many folks working in technology and gaming and in engineering and, of course, in science. So what science fiction stories, worlds, movies have been most influential for you?
Yeah, I mean, I'm old now, but growing up, the classics. So some of my favorite books as a kid were Rendezvous with Rama, Arthur C. Clarke, Gateway, Frederick Pohl, Stephen King, The Stand. And that was just books that I consumed for fun. It didn't seem to have much to do with the rest of my life. In the 1990s, when I first got involved with internet companies and was involved in starting the first gaming company that I was involved in, I discovered William Gibson. And for the first time, I felt like, hey, this person's writing science fiction, but it's predicting the future of this industry that I'm working in. And I really kind of dove in fresh, into that world. I really hadn't spent a lot of time reading, sci-fi in the kind of couple of decades in between. But yeah, William Gibson was my way in, and I've read, basically everything that he's written since. And Neil Stephenson after that, and in recent years, Daniel Suarez, I think writes, a lot about the very near future and extrapolating everything from drones to AI to biohacking, all of which seem only like a half step ahead of Elon Musk. So it seems worthwhile to stay abreast of what's going to happen next.
Yeah, for sure. So one thing that's sort of interesting about William Gibson's work, and I don't know how many people here have read Neuromancer, but if you haven't, I highly recommend it. But one of the things we were actually chatting about before walking in here today was how a lot of the technology that features in the futures that Gibson's books portray feels almost invisible. Right? You don't really see the plumbing behind all of these new gadgets and how they actually work. And I think that one of the really interesting things about Pokmon GO and what you've been working on is how, in VR, sometimes there's a big focus on the technology itself, right? And one of the reasons why Pokmon GO was so easy for people to start playing is that it almost just felt magical from the beginning, right? Like I didn't actually have to learn how to do something in order to play. It just started working. Where does that intersect, right? Like how do you create an experience that's magical using new technology and make sure that the focus is on the experience itself?
I mean, isn't that an Arthur C. Clarke quote? Like the technology is indistinguishable from magic at a certain level. Yeah, I mean, we're trying to use every technological means available to us and to invent new technology where necessary to enable the kinds of entertainment experiences that we really, really want to have. So, what we're doing is just trying to look broadly out there about, what state of the art is, and then to look for those surgical places where we can make a meaningful, significant step forward to enable some new kind of fun experience that people haven't had before. So with Pokmon Go, that was integrating maps and location with a really well-known IP, obviously, and a social experience, which one of the earlier speakers kind of alluded to, which I think is really the heart of the game. It was this idea of playing a game in public with other people, where you walked around and sure you stared at your screen some of the time, but some of the time you're just hanging out with your buddies and hopefully seeing a new part of town. Next, we're looking at how do we make that even more immersive and how do you allow more people to have a shared experience together in public space. So we're investing heavily in this concept of the AR cloud, which is to enable people to share a high precision, high fidelity, augmented reality view together in public. And it kind of draws on our mapping roots. And I'm super excited about the kind of gameplay experiences that that's going to enable in the future. In the beginning, it may not be so invisible. It may be a little bit clunky. I think we would aspire to get the technology to a level that feels really natural and you don't feel awkward using it. One of the great things about games and gamers as a way to kind of pioneer new technology, I think, though, is that gamers are willing to put up with some glitches and some imperfections in tech, which makes it just a great area to really push some of these new technologies forward into the frontier where things don't always work exactly the way you want them to.
Yeah, so that's actually a really interesting point. One of Gibson's favorite or most often quoted lines is that the future has already arrived. It's just not very evenly distributed yet, right? And one of the things that I always look for when I'm trying to figure out interesting questions to explore in a new novel is, okay, how can we figure out where are the pockets of the future that has yet to arrive, right? Like how do you actually find those in the present, right? Before they become really mainstream. And I think that games are actually a really, really fascinating example of that because there's this inherent joy to using them, right? Like you find so many interesting aspects of technology that has emerged from people who are just screwing around for fun. So what are some interesting things you're seeing in the gaming community that might have like big second or third tier implications down the road? Basically, help me do my job.
Well, I mean, starting with the obvious, I think, AR itself is something that a lot of us have discovered for the first time through games, but obviously has implications that go far beyond that, which is why I think you see Google and Apple and Facebook and all the majors kind of lined up behind it and investing so heavily in it now. And I really think it's, a transformative technology that stands to, take the position, from the cell phone as the primary device that we use to communicate and interact with the world. AR glasses probably will be that next device. So, incredibly important. The tech that drives it, this AR cloud that will drive games, will also drive non-gaming applications in that future, which, is part of the reason we're so excited to invest in that. But there are other areas that, I think are equally interesting. Artificial intelligence, virtual actors, virtual humans. I've met a couple of companies doing some really interesting work in that area, which again, I think is broadly applicable, but the most obvious gaming application is, you can finally go into an inn and talk to the bartender and have them not just send you on the same quest that everybody else went on. The opportunity to interact with characters that are truly lifelike, that truly respond to you, that truly inhabit a world that you're creating that's fictional, that's pretty mind-blowing, I think. And that technology is not that far away. The opportunity to do that with a traditional console game or PC game is pretty cool. But when you combine that with, when I think about that combined with augmented reality, imagine you're sitting in a coffee shop and, a virtual character walks in and takes the chair opposite you and then invites you into this, Morpheus-like, into this quest. I think that's pretty exciting. Blockchain, Brian was really, I think, obviously he's always kind of one step ahead of people in his thinking. That's super relevant, I think, for games and for society generally. Gets at a kind of root problem around identity, which if you look at the toxicity, the lack of accountability, the lack of trust in terms of what we see online, which you explored in Bandwidth, I think in a very interesting way. It really comes down to the fact that you don't know who you're talking to. You don't know who that entity really is on Twitter or even Facebook. And blockchain, there is a path there to solve that problem. It's one fraught with challenges around control and potential abuse. but very interesting. And I think in games there are a host of potential applications, ranging from just paying for things to tradable goods to games that can be recombined into new games. Really, a whole new part of the industry probably will open up around that kind of concept ultimately.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I saw a news item last year that really, I just found it was really strange, and that was that there were a number of U.S. Navy vessels colliding in the South China Sea, and they were trying to figure out, like, well, what's happening here? And the initial reaction from the Pentagon was that it was all the captain's fault, right? And that there was this issue, and they would have to figure out why these mistakes were made so they could improve training. But then they went back and discovered that there were a number of commercial ships in the Arctic that had the same problem. Suddenly their GPS told them that they were 50 miles away from where the ship actually was. And then tracking back through that, I discovered that one of the first big sort of examples of GPS spoofing was in Moscow, where folks playing Pokmon GO would suddenly see the Pokemon disappear, and it was, I guess, 20 miles the other way. And same with Uber drivers, right? So where they were supposed to drop you off suddenly wound up being on the other side of town. Now, you have a really interesting history because you've helped make Google Earth, and through that Google Maps, and now Pokemon GO. So you're behind that somewhere. And I think it's a really interesting example of...
So Eliot, are you saying the Russians crashed the Navy ship? Because that sounds like a really interesting book. I think maybe you should write that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty sure there's some folks at the Pentagon, like maybe you're writing that as a report right now. I can try to popularize it. But I think that this is a smaller example of a bigger trend, which is that we're basically turning our entire world into a computer game, right? So when you drove up here, you were driving in a car that was really just a computer you drive in. We're going to go home to houses that are really computers we live in. Wall Street has actually just basically existed in the digital world for a long time, and you have weird examples of flash crashes and stuff like that where you're just seeing these weird ramifications there, right? Where we're building the world into a computer game, and so now the logic of building computer games applies to many other areas in the world. And one thing you guys might not know about John's background, if you're more familiar with his recent work, is that he started out working in the State Department. And then transitioned into working in games and tech. So I'd be really interested hearing your perspective on, if you've had that experience working in geopolitics, then you took a different turn to work in technology and gaming, and now somehow geopolitics is coming back to have an impact on the gaming industry as a whole. How do you see that? What lessons did you learn from that previous life that you're now applying, and what lessons should people in this room sort of think about as we are building this very strange future?
Well, that's an interesting question. Yeah, I actually came back to my first love, which was making games on computers, which is something I did as a teenager. So I kind of took this diversion into policy and then came back to that. But yeah, whenever the virtual meets the real, it does cause unexpected things to happen sometimes. And it has been interesting to see, my world in making computer, entertainment, internet projects, intersect with State Department and foreign policy and things of that nature. It was really interesting with Google Maps. This was really one of the first widely consumed global maps. And the thing that I didn't fully appreciate is to the extent to which in countries around the world really presented maps to the people of that country in the way that they wanted them to consume them. So there was a lot of what you might classify crassly as propaganda, but a very filtered view of the world in terms of the maps and the maps that were printed and distributed and that were approved for local use. What we found was that we stepped into kind of massive global controversy with the naming of certain islands that sit between Korea and Japan, or the way that borders are drawn between India and China, the way that the Gulf of Arabia and the Persian Gulf refer to the same body of water, but there are very different preferences between Iran and the United Arab Emirates about which name should be used. And so I found these letters starting to pile up on my desk from embassies, demanding that we correct the inaccuracies in our data. So that was kind of my first brush with the digital colliding with real. In Pokemon GO, it took a different turn whenever massive crowds of people started showing up in public parks around the world. People started passing laws about when and how Pokemon Go could be played, which was kind of bizarre. There was a town in France that outlawed Pokemon Go completely. And we heard from cabinet level people in Japan, for example, the ministry in charge of public safety and so on, just wanting to understand what's going on and what knobs are you dialing and how can they be dialed and how can we coordinate with you to make sure that nothing bad happens. A lot of it was unfounded fear, I think, and just kind of communicating what augmented reality is and what it means to put these digital creations on top of the physical world means and why we really shouldn't be afraid of it. There is some interesting policy ground ahead of us, though, with AR. There is a tendency, among people to confuse this digital thing, which I liken to an entry in a database with a latitude and longitude associated with it. But when you perceive it as something physical, through your phone or in the future through glasses, some people want to construe that with a physical object and apply laws that that would be applied to as if I constructed a physical statue in the park, or as if I was, having a rock concert in the park. And so laws related to property and private property and all of that are trying to be applied to augmented reality in a way that I think could be very detrimental to the advance of that industry and could be an intrusion on personal liberty. What you consume through your earbuds, I think, is your own business, and by the same token, what you consume through your VR or AR glasses ought to be your own business. But it's something that people are really wrestling with conceptually right now in terms of how to think about that from a policy point of view.
And maybe taking AR specifically, I feel like whenever we deal with anything that's a buzzword, there's sort of the hot topics that always hit the blogosphere, right? And for people outside of the industry, sometimes that just feels like that's the reality of what's actually going on when people are working on developing those technologies. So what are some aspects about AR that you think the general public actually makes incorrect assumptions about? Or things that you've noticed working with AR technology that are somehow not getting enough attention, right? Important questions that we're not asking ourselves.
Well, when we started first working in the area of AR, we actually refrained from using the term AR because it was a dirty word not that many years ago. In 2009, 2010, there had been a wave of AR apps for mobile devices that didn't work very well. They were very gimmicky. They were used in a lot of advertising and promotional kinds of things, and it was just sort of a dud. It was something that had come and gone. But when we started thinking about the potential there, for us it really extended well beyond displaying something as an overlay in the video screen. It was really about how you could use technology to connect a user with the physical world in some interesting way, to tell them about it, to lead them to a place they hadn't been before, or to create some way for people to come together at a certain spot together. And how that was manifested, whether it was a point on a map, whether it was a text message that got sent to you, whether it was an online alternate reality game with a puzzle, with a clue that you solved that would lead you to a place together, whether it was delivered by audio, those are all mechanisms to this kind of bigger idea of augmenting reality, taking the plain vanilla world that we see and experience with our kind of unaltered senses and adding additional stuff to it. I think after the sort of popularization of AR that came and AR Kit came to market, and now we have AR Core from Google, everybody is really focused almost exclusively on this visualization piece, which as a gamer and somebody who I like and value graphics and fidelity in graphics, I understand that. But I think there's a misunderstanding that is really all there is to augmented reality, is purely about the visual and how good can we make the visual, how accurately can we register things, how bright can we make the image. And I think the potential for AR is much bigger than that, and there's a chance it may not even include visuals as a primary way that we access it. Going back to science fiction, I think the movie Her may be the future. Like, it could be an audio-based version of AR that is the one that is the most widely adopted. It's the least challenging from a technology point of view. We can basically do the tech today on the device side. What's missing is the cloud-based smarts to really make that thing that's whispering in your ear hyper-intelligent so that it's not annoying. It's actually useful and valuable. So there's the Internet of Things. Like, not just putting something in glasses, but allowing the world around you to react to you because maybe you're identified through some sort of beacon or handshake between yourself and any kind of device or signage or anything that you might interact with. So rather than just projecting the world into glasses, the world could be lighting up and interacting with you, a la Minority Report, hopefully not bombarding you with horrible ads, but maybe telling you useful things or showing you information that you want to see. So AR is a pretty big concept in my point of view, and I think there's a ton of opportunity out there that exists outside of this domain of just purely the graphics visualization part. And I think from a creative point of view, things like audio or audio-based experiences are really untapped and wide open in terms of making really creative games and other experiences.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And we sort of started out this conversation talking about some of the examples of like gadgets that were science fiction inspired. But one of the things that makes me think of, that I think a lot about when I'm writing science fiction, is how a lot of the value there, in addition to entertainment, is not so much that it gives us like really specific maps for how to make sense of the future, but more that like traveling to a foreign country, when you read a science fiction novel or watch Ready Player One or whatever your sort of favorite kind of way to experience a story is, that when you return to your normal life, suddenly you start seeing assumptions that you didn't realize you were making before, right? And I think that's really where you've sort of taken us. And with that, I think we are out of time. Right, Dean? Yeah.
Oh,
I'm getting
I thought we were
the
just
nod.
getting started.
Yeah, I know.
Awesome.
All right, well, thanks so much. Yeah.